Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to all of you from around the world. My name is Eric Baber. I'm the Director for Professional Learning and Development here at Cambridge University Press, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you and our speaker of the morning, Ben Goldstein, to day one of the Cambridge Live Experience. We hope to see you here, lots of you, over the next few days. We have an absolutely jam-packed agenda with lots of talks, inspirational talks as well. So not just academic stuff, but also fun, more lighthearted sessions. So we hope to see you at many of them over the next 3 days. Just before I introduce Goldstein, he lives in Barcelona in Spain and works as an English teacher, teacher trainer, and materials writer. He has taught for over 20 years in the UK, Spain, and Hong Kong, and currently also teaches materials writing on an online ESOL Masters, the degree program at the New School in New York. So Ben, welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Great to see you here.
And thank you to all the participants. I can see, well, the figures are going up, but more than 1,000. So that's wonderful. And I hope you'll enjoy this session. I'll be talking about the Great Reset today. I look at how we have been doing over the last 6 months since the pandemic and where we might be headed. Difficult to make predictions, of course, but some observations that might that help us in the future now that some of us have started back in the classroom again. The classes here in Spain started in some provinces yesterday. And in so doing, we'll be looking at some of the opportunities that have arisen for us, some unlikely opportunities, unexpected ones. And of course, we'll be also analyzing the obstacles that have come in our way too. And finally, we'll look at the language that has been used to describe the consequences of the pandemic. For example, the Great Reset in particular will be focusing on this term. And we'll be trying to analyze the implications of this term. What are the implications for our profession and whether it's a helpful or unhelpful construct for us. So here is a brief overview of what we've been looking at. The impact of the pandemic first, then the whole notion of teacher as student well-being. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is based on teacher testimonies. So I'll be looking at different quotations, different examples from different contexts of different teachers working all over the world who have kindly sent me their testimonies. And I'll be basing some of the conclusions in this talk on these testimonies. Then we'll be looking at the pandemic as a pretext for change. As I said, focusing on whether this is an obstacle for us or an opportunity, or maybe a bit of both, and then a few conclusions. So quite a lot to get through in the next 35 minutes. So first of all, the impact of the pandemic, how have we been teaching? Now, I know it's very risky with so many people to offer a chat question, but I thought it would be interesting just to see what you think. What adjective would you use to describe how you have been teaching in the last 6 months since the pandemic started? Okay, so we've got fun, flipped, online. Yeah, I was thinking more, not a kind of subjective adjective, but more like the online kind of idea. A lot of people are saying online, with courage, uncertain. Yeah, this is amazing. It's a blended, dynamic, Skype, Zoom, inclusively. Some very nice ideas. I think it's important that we consider the language that we use to describe what we're doing carefully. And in this, from Julie Moore, I don't know if you've heard of her, there is a link to her website and blog. She's a lexicographer and she has analyzed the use of the adjectives, the collocations that we use to describe learning and teaching. And she said that, and I quote, remote didn't really appear before COVID. They had online and distance collocations, so distance learning, online learning, distance teaching, online teaching, but remote really didn't appear until the last 6 months or so. And I think this is quite revealing. And here you can see the web corpus that she uses, all online sources, and you can see she tracks the usage over time. So you can see there that remote, in terms of learning, the word remote, and then the word remote with the collocation with teaching has increased enormously. And this is from April, obviously not as much as online. So it struck me, and looking at her blog and reading some of her observations, it struck me that there were differences between remote and online. And it was interesting that some of you did write online there in the chat. A lot of you did. And there's obviously good reason for that. But I think perhaps we should make a distinction between the two. Again, this is based a lot on the teacher testimonies that I have been listening to over the last few months. I have observed remote classes in Zoom, but I am an online teacher myself, if you can see what the difference is, and I'll try and explain that now. So I would say, again, remember that this is perhaps not 100% true, obviously depends on your context, but I think we can distinguish between remote teaching and online teaching, in that what most of us, I feel, have been doing in the last 6 months is remote teaching in an emergency situation, whereas online teaching is teaching designed to be delivered in that way. I teach on an online program, an MA program for the new school in New York, which is 100% asynchronous, just some tutorials which are synchronous with particular students, but otherwise the whole course is online. Remote as well, perhaps not all the learning is online. For example, project work could be, and you'll see some examples later of other teachers who have supplemented their remote teaching with other ideas, partly because the internet connection is not always reliable. So not all learning perhaps is online, whereas in the MA that I teach, 100% of the content is delivered online and is designed to be delivered in that way. It seems to me that remote suggests some element of improvisation, whereas online suggests a fixed syllabus, fixed content. And finally, online, it also implies the adaptation of face-to-face classes, which after all, with all of us who have been involved in this have had to do, is to adapt the face-to-face classroom, the context which we were used to for this new context, this new emergency situation. And I think online implies an established mode of delivery similar to distance teaching. So again, as I said, I don't think necessarily these that will be applied to everybody, and some people may use remote and online in a very similar way. But I think it's helpful to make this distinction apart from anything else, because of what I'll be saying later, that many people in the EdTech industry are now celebrating online teaching and saying this is going to transform, thanks to the pandemic, this is going to transform the way we teach. But I would suggest that we haven't actually been teaching online in the way that they intend us to think of that, but rather remotely, which is a whole different kettle of fish. So looking at the teacher testimonies, what opportunities have arisen? What good has come out of teaching remotely? This is the term I'll be using. And there's a lot of things here, 8 bullet points. I hope not to drown you with bullet points, but I do think it's important for us to just consider these opportunities. Remember that these testimonies that I've collated, a lot of them are contradictory, but I have managed to, I think, extract 8 clear opportunities, 8 clear positive messages, and 8 obstacles or 8 more negative messages. So it's clear that teachers now have a new repertoire of skills. I mean, before we started this, a lot of people were very nervous about teaching remotely, and suddenly were thrown into the deep end. And now we do have this repertoire of skills that we have acquired very quickly, and we shouldn't lose those. There's been greater flexibility, creativity, and risk-taking. This came through again and again in the testimonies that I've collated, and in just seeing blog posts and webinars from teachers all over the world. These 3 elements have really come to the fore. There's more awareness of time. In fact, after this session at 10 o'clock Spanish time, 9 o'clock UK time, Olya Madlos will be talking about this, the whole issue of time. In fact, some of the points I'm going to make are obviously, this is a very general, big picture kind of talk. And other speakers at this Cambridge Live event will be speaking more specifically about issues that arise, that I will mention here. For example, the issue of time, more awareness of time, both in and outside class. And I think this is something which is clearly been an opportunity. A lot of people working from home have more time, but at the same time, they're working and living in the same environment, and this also can be counterproductive. But we're more aware of time, I think, in general, as a result of working remotely. And some teachers, I say some, have forged very strong connections, stronger connections with their students. Other opportunities, a greater sense of community and collaboration. This seems to have comes up again and again in feedback from teachers and with parents, especially in young learner classes, as you would imagine. And more awareness of what makes a positive learning environment. All these things are, I think, inherently positive for us, that that teachers are aware now of what makes a positive learning environment in general, and seeing different classroom dynamics in the face-to-face classroom, and then seeing those dynamics change radically in the remote classroom has certainly given many teachers pause for thought. Increased learner independence seems to be something, again, this is one of the things that has arisen again. This may have maybe a plus and a minus though. So some students thrive as a result of having more learner independence. Other students may struggle with this notion of needing to be more autonomous. And of course, we've given more importance to student and teacher well-being as well. And we'll talk about this more later. And the bad stuff, some of the obstacles, well, in some contexts, the digital divide has become an educational divide. And I'll be talking about a couple of examples a bit later of that. Excuse me. Students may need to be more independent for these remote classes to function. So again, this is not always easy to achieve. And again, teachers have said again and again that they cover less material in remote classes, and there is less opportunity for working with emergent language. And again, we've seen that some students respond very well, but some students respond poorly to the remote environment, i.e. the question of turning off cameras and so on, which obviously in some cases is a legal question, but this, in many of the classes I've observed, this is a real issue. And again, as I mentioned, flexibility is expected, but can really upset the life and work balance for all of us, for teachers and students alike. Harder to connect, especially when learners are invisible, and more teacher talking time as a result. This is another one of the obstacles that seems to have arisen. And for some teachers, feedback and empathy are more difficult to achieve in a remote context. Again, this varied enormously. I found that some teachers spoke about greater opportunities for personalized feedback in chat, for example, in Zoom. But others said that it was much more difficult for them to achieve this. So again, this was one of the issues where there seemed to be a big difference of opinion. And I think this is an interesting point, and one that hasn't been discussed enough, is that some students feel the remote model devalues their course. And I think this is something that we find in teacher training courses, where the face-to-face model was the whole point of the course, is that it is face-to-face, and then to do it remotely feels that in some ways it's devaluing what the students are doing. So the good things and bad things that have arisen, I know that was a rather quick kind of route through those, but I think it shows you some of the positive and negative aspects that have arisen from the remote learning environment. But what is clear, and what came up very much so when I did an Ask Me Anything session for Cambridge back in May, that's when we were at the really confined with Sarah Mercer, Anne Robinson. There was the whole idea of the boundaries between work and home life having merged. And what Sarah said, which I think is very true, is that remote option has to be of benefit to teachers and learners professionally and emotionally, and not at their expense. but she did say that post-traumatic growth is possible, which I liked. If you're interested in checking out that Ask Me Anything session from May, when we were trying to anticipate what was going to happen when we returned to the classroom, then there's a link for that. And I know these slides will be available anyway, so that you can make a note of that later. So the issue of social and emotional learning, resilience, of course, all of these issues were being talked about a lot before the pandemic, but now they've really come to the forefront. And I think this is one of the consequences of the pandemic, is that it's not so much that it has brought new areas of an interest necessarily to the fore, but it's the speed in which these are now suddenly becoming more and more relevant because of the crisis. And I think very revealing now, looking back, that was May, in the comments in Facebook. Here are a couple of comments from colleagues of mine who I know personally. Jessica Mackay, she says here in the comments in Facebook, for many of my adult learners, the class has been a form of human contact outside the immediate family. The socio-affective aspect has been hugely important. And I think this is something that recurs again. And Mark Andrews saying, would be good to spend 2 weeks when students do finally go back to school, discussing and evaluating this whole period together before any subject teaching starts. And I think this is looking forward to now, to September. If we had the luxury to be able to do that, that would be wonderful, because I think that we are starting to realize that as a result of the pandemic, we are not just deliverers of content, we are not just transmitting knowledge, but our relationship with our students has been hugely changed, and the socio-affective aspect, as Jessica says, has really come to the fore. A couple of examples from Brazil, if you're interested, again, please take a note of the link, of examples of initiatives that go beyond just teaching. This is from the Cambridge Brazil YouTube channel. And this one, Paulo Capistrano is an English teacher in Sao Paulo, and he helps the LGBTQ community, among others, offering classes to people in situations of social vulnerability and promoting awareness of mental health issues. So that's a very interesting example of an initiative that goes beyond just teaching English, just delivering content. Another example from an excellent talk that I recommend, again, the link is there at the bottom of your screen, also from Brazil, Raquel Ribeiro, a teacher's journey through the pandemic. And she explained 3 different initiatives involving empathy and creativity that were used in Brazil to overcome difficulties. And this is what I meant about remote teaching not always being online. In some parts of the country, a very reliable internet connection was not possible. And so she left homework on the railing of the school for the students to pick up, so that they had material to study. In another context, the students were able to access content via the radio, again, because radio broadcast, because the internet connection was not reliable. And the third example is an example of empathy shown by a student to a teacher who is having difficulties with technology. I really highly recommend that talk from the Cambridge days in Brazil. If you're interested, the link is there, Raquel Ribeiro. So it seems to me then, to conclude this section on socio and affective learning, emotional learning, teaching remotely, we may need then to assume a role of nurturers and carers rather than deliverers of content, and develop a greater awareness of the individual. And when we go back to the face-to-face classroom, I think these are issues. This is what I meant about not giving up. These are things that we have discovered teaching remotely. If we are going to go back to the face-to-face classroom, then we shouldn't forget these. We shouldn't consider these as new skills that we've developed only to be used remotely, but rather these are values, skills and attitudes which will stand us in good stead in the face-to-face classroom as well. And an issue of differentiation and resilience and self-care. These are issues that are going to come up in the Cambridge Live experience. Tomorrow, there are 2 talks on these issues. So looking at teacher testimonies in more specific ones, I mentioned those positive and negative aspects before of the obstacles and opportunities. But if you want some more specific ones, here I recommend a excellent roundtable initiative from Argentina. I don't think many people will be connected in Latin America right now, but I've got a lot of examples from there. Alistair Grant has set up this panel discussion called We're All in This Together. And he, a roundtable a couple of weeks ago, focused on 3 teachers in 3 completely different contexts, in 3 completely different countries, in the private sector, in the public sector, the Philippines, Argentina, and Romania. And it was fascinating to hear, in particular, the difference between the teacher trainees, or all teacher trainers. It was fascinating to see the difference in between, for example, Mariano Quinterno, who works in the public sector in Argentina, Buenos Aires, and Katinka Nicolau, who works in the International House, the private sector in Romania. And they had, very, as you can imagine, very, very different takes on what has been happening in the language classroom. Katinka a lot more positive than Mariano. And I've got 3 quotations now from teachers I know well who working in different countries around the world. And again, all very positive about the remote experience. This is Lucy Crichton teaching young learners. And one of the things she says is that, which I think is very revealing, she's become more flexible and open-minded. She's my age, so in her 50s. So somebody, again, who perhaps doesn't come, it was something relatively new to teach remotely. And she was happy, though, that quite a lot of things that we've been teaching in my school for the last 18 years are still pertinent. And I think that's very interesting, that this suggests to me that good teaching practice is similar, regardless of the delivery mode, regardless of whether you're teaching face-to-face or whether you're teaching remotely. And then she talks about the practical living side of the language that the student loves, and that prepares them for these challenging times. So very positive feedback from Lucy. Likewise, Fran Lamley, teaching adult learners in Spain. She says it's definitely the way forward for university students. They save time traveling and are far more technologically minded. So it's become second nature. But then interestingly, she said that her over 50 students are dying to get back into the face-to-face classroom because they see that as it's a social event. And so the classroom is not only, of course, about learning the language, developing a new skill, but about meeting and having that human contact, that connection every week. And she also mentioned the interesting point, which a lot of teachers have mentioned, which is this idea that in a remote classes, very quiet students in face-to-face classrooms come out of their shell. And she mentioned that as well, which I think is a truism. And finally, Kerry Jones, who's my co-author on many books for Cambridge. This is a remote lesson observation of trainees, so in a teacher training course. And she highlighted the attitude to the text. So she was saying here that she saw the same lesson being, she observed the same lesson. So 2 different teachers teaching the same students, 2 different trainees, and that the second one was much more relaxed and greater conversation and management and so on, because she considered to do with the attitude to the tech. I think very revealing as well. So those are some testimonies from different teachers and in different contexts, some very positive. I wanted to highlight the positive aspects, but some also a little bit more negative about what's been going on. But I wanted, as we're coming to the last 10, 15 minutes, to talk about that pandemic as a pretext for change, an obstacle or an opportunity, because I think what's very interesting is this kind of language, the idea of the Great Reset, which this comes from the World Economic Forum website. I think the kind of language that we use to describe what's happening or what could happen in the future, the new normal is another example, I think can be both an opportunity and an obstacle. But I think we have to remember that what has arisen, what we have been doing over the last few months has been an emergency situation. We have not gone there through choice. It has just happened. And some have embraced it more than others. But I think there are many obviously many economic interests, a lot of people benefiting from this in the edtech industry benefiting from this situation. And I think we need to be careful of this kind of language and what the implications of it. For example, this is the kind of thing you might find on the World Economic Forum website. COVID has changed education forever, and this is how, and it refers to a lot of points which I think are dubious assertions that online learning takes less time, increases retention of information, and so on. And this is where we are now going to be going forever. It is the transformation. EdTech, people, the powers that be in EdTech are always pointing to the transformative quality of education technology. And I think the idea is that users of this phrase, the Great Reset, for example, what they're doing, of course, is selling us this idea, and sometimes there's a product as well behind it, that we need to get used to this new reality. We need a great reset. We need a new configuration. And that is one in which technology will play a greater part, of course. And I think this is where we need to be critical and skeptical a little bit of these assertions, because I think they could be unhelpful for us in our profession. Interestingly, on the same website, the World Economic Forum, there are people who offer a different view, a more critical view, and one which I'm inclined to agree with. And here we can see a point of view which I think is very interesting in comparison with the usual way that we refer to the new normal and the Great Reset. So here, Chime Osonye, I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, he says, the language of a new normal is being deployed as a way to quell any uncertainty ushered in by the coronavirus. But the language we employ matters. It helps in some ways to have these terms like the Great Reset. But discussion of these terms should not be the lens through which we examine today's crisis. So I do think we need to be critical. I think this is a very good point, and that we should not be thinking that we have to transform our practice overnight, which is what some the powers that be in education technology would like us to think we should be doing. And I think that is very a very good point and very pertinent. And among our profession, of course, these comments from the World Economic Forum are talking in general, but of course there are other more critical voices within our profession, within ELT, like Scott Thornberry, and here is a quotation from him, which you can read while I have some water. And I think that many teachers, however positive the remote teaching experience has been for them, I think a lot of us would agree with this, and not just the old school. And finally, if you want a very critical blog or critical example of articles about the edtech industry from a critical view, by Ben Williamson's blog, I highly recommend, and this is, he is very critical of the idea that edtech, the concept is that education is broken and techs can fix it. And this has been going on for a long time, he says here. The current pandemic is being used as an experimental opportunity for edtech to demonstrate its benefits, not just in an emergency, but as a normal mode of education into the future. And of course, as I said, there are economic interests at heart here. So just to conclude then, will there be a great reset? Certainly some people want us to feel that is the case. And as I said, I've tried to show some critical ways that we can analyze this language here. I don't pretend to have the answers at all about what's going to happen now as we go back, some of us, to the face-to-face classroom. But I hope in the next few slides, just to conclude, to share some observations of what might happen based on teacher testimonies. And here's an example of somebody who is both an EdTech and an ELT specialist, Paolo Dantas, is a good friend of mine. I asked him seriously, I said, Paolo, do you think there will be a great reset? Do you think this is going to herald transform the way we all teach, and that the remote model will, you know, live on past the pandemic. And he says this, I'll just let you read that. And I think that's very interesting because a lot of these changes that people are suggesting are going to happen, they seem to want them to happen fast. And as we've seen in ELT, things don't happen that fast. Changes take place. But although this pandemic has accelerated those changes, he says, I think quite interesting here, that I wouldn't expect a revolution in the near future, but we might see some positive change in the long run. And he's talking about teachers' more positive attitude to EdTech in general. So I'm very reluctant to make predictions, but just based on, just have 3 minutes left, just based on the teacher testimonies that I've mentioned, here are just some thoughts. I think it depends a lot on the context, what's going to happen. But talking to teachers around the world in different contexts, it does seem to me that in adult and higher education, the remote model was more likely to stick. Fran, my colleague, ex-colleague in Granada in Spain, she feels very much that is the case, that this remote model will stick. And this possibly is true because of adults spending a lot of time to get to their classes and so on, and feeling that the remote model is more convenient in that respect. In some private language schools, PLS's private language schools, I think may need to offer remote blended classes to survive. If they have face-to-face classes, at least in the short term, these classes will have to be smaller for safety reasons. So I think this may well be what's going to happen to PLSs. Freelancers, again, I think especially in big cities around the world, I don't know, I think a lot of people I noticed were connecting from big cities like Manila and so on. I saw some of the attendees there. I think they will travel less. There will be more remote classes, but I do wonder where is the saturation point with remote classes. How many classes in Zoom can you teach in one day without going completely mad? No? And it seems for the young learners, again, based on what Lucy told me, I think that the face-to-face model won't change significantly. Obviously, younger learners need to attend face-to-face classes and for various reasons, but there will be greater collaboration and more blended approaches. The rise of project-based learning, I think, is one of those interesting trends. But in general, speaking very generally, obviously it depends on the context, depends whether you're teaching adults, young learners, private sector, public sector, but in general, it seems that there will be a greater awareness of the environment in which we learn and teach. I think this can only be a good thing. While we still in the Northern Hemisphere or in the summer go out and teach in the physical environment, in the physical space outside is very, very positive. Also greater awareness of the group, the environment, both online in a remote context and in the classroom, and the differences in the classroom dynamics. That I think is fascinating. And as I said, the remote learning teaching we've been doing has really made us more aware of this. And some things I think will stay remote, perhaps outside the regular face-to-face classroom context. So staff meetings among teachers, homework, the whole concept of homework has changed radically, and I think will probably stay as well. And social and emotional learning will impact more and more. And I think that's a great benefit for us, that this is something that is really on the agenda now. As I said, something that was brewing, becoming more fashionable, let's say, in ELT, but now is having even greater impact. And I hope to show you some examples of that earlier. And then finally, of course, EdTech's role will grow even more quickly, but perhaps not as quickly as they would like to think. I would also add more tailored method of instruction as well to this now, perhaps more differentiation as well. And final slide, then some final thoughts based on the testimonies and based on my observations and reading around the whole issue of what may come for us now in the next few months. I would say don't lose the skills you've acquired. As I said, we've all we've all learned incredibly fast. If anyone had told you what you would have, if someone had said to you before the pandemic, you're going to be doing this, this, and this, you would never imagine that you could have done. And we've acquired incredible amount of skills. And I think these are going to be relevant both face-to-face and remotely. They're not skills necessarily that I think they are skills that are transferable from one context to the other. And good teaching pedagogy remains the same, whatever the context. We saw this, I think, from the quote from Lucille. That was the conclusion that I drew from that. And I think this is something, again, that is a real truism. If it works well face-to-face, it's going to work well remotely, and vice versa, regardless of the differences that obviously exist in those environments. And keep your and your students' well-being at the forefront of what you do. And I think, again, the emergency situation, the crisis, the trauma that we've all been through, we've realized this kind of instinctively, intuitively. But I think when hopefully this is all over, that will be a really strong positive aspect that we can draw from this pandemic, along with the skills we've acquired. The greater focus on teacher and student well-being is also something that I hope will carry on after this is all over, which I hope will be soon. And finally, change will come, but it looks like, at least to me, that won't be a great revolution. The Great Reset, as has been stated so much recently, may have to wait for another day. So thank you very much for listening. And now I will take any questions. I think we have 10 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Just
questions, Eric. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ben, for that really fantastic session. And one thing that showcased how excellent it was and well thought through it was is from the beginning I've been gathering questions.
Oh, really?
And 2
I'm not aware of any of this.
You answered them already in the presentation.
Mm.
But there's, okay, so I've pulled out a few things, some comments which sort of lead to maybe discussion point.
Yeah.
So you've already spoken about the difference in how young learners behave and adults and their perceptions and their likes and dislikes. That was a big talking point in the chat. So Michelle Veal, for example, started off by saying younger learners suffer more. Jennifer Espinosa countered that with young learners have fun.
Yeah.
And she followed that later on by saying, we teach no matter what, even lessons by WhatsApp. We work with young learners. We've got great results. It also depends on their relatives' commitment and support.
Yeah.
And then Lydia raised a very good point that students have to accept that self-study is a must and need to become education aware and appreciate high-tech gadgets as everyday learning tools rather than tools for playing games.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'd like to round this off with Kirsten Hemingway, I think, introduces a really interesting element, which is question. Has learning been more specific to each student in your opinion? So we've got some people saying young learners suffer, some young learners love it, adults don't like the commute and so on. Is maybe one of the resets from this a greater appreciation that every learner is different?
Yeah.
And that we as teachers need to cater for a wider variety of learning needs.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said at the end there that, I mean, I didn't want to put too many bullet points because I really wanted to keep that last slide with just 4 points, but I did mention differentiation and that will be spoken. I think it's Betty Parish talking about that tomorrow in more detail. I think that may be the idea of a more tailored approach. It may be something that the teachers will have to bear in mind, and the consequence of what we've been seeing, that they will realize that students respond very differently. But I do think in the case of young learners, I mean, I am not by any means a young learner specialist. I've taught teens, but I've never personally taught young learners. But talking to, I mean, Lucy is probably one of my best contacts in the young learner sort of segment. And I mean, she is very, very positive about the whole remote model. But she did say, I think, or I have heard, and it is logical, that the young learners do need the physical presence of the teacher more than other learners. And apart from anything else, they need to go to school for, for family reasons, for all kinds of other reasons, and rather than in which adults don't have that, So I do think I think that's going to impact, that's where I think it's going to impact the least. But I think that it does require, at least from what I've gathered, it does require a different kind of skill set on the teacher's part, and that many students will have a very different response to remote context. Especially young learners will have a very different response.
Which leads us on to the next big discussion point. So Sylvia Lithes Estrada, for example, says, greetings from Guatemala.
Well, it's early there. Maybe she hasn't gone to bed.
Yeah, right. I'm concerned about balancing quantity and quality with regards to teaching remote and online. And Nirab Sharma sort of follows that up relatedly. Teachers should be trained to develop technology skills. So where does teacher training come into all of this?
Well, I think the issue of quantity and quality, I mean, again, what we've seen again and again is that you teach less material. I think that is something that I've seen again and again in the testimonies, in my observations. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing. We're giving students different opportunities in breakout rooms and so on for peer learning. They're learning in a different way. And it isn't just about getting through the course book and getting through that unit. You will be able to do, I mean, there are warmers, for example, short tasks are very difficult, it seems to me, to achieve it remotely. And so you do need to think of tasks in a different way and kind of perhaps be less ambitious about what you can achieve in one remote class than what you might have been able to achieve face-to-face. So I think the quality quantity thing is a bit of a red herring. What was the other question? Sorry, Eric.
Well, just relatedly, how does this find its way into teacher training? Will teacher training incorporate this, or should they?
Well, I think that the affordances, unexpected affordances, even accidental affordances of Zoom, for example, the chat boxes, the breakout rooms, there have been all kinds of interesting observations from teachers around how this has. Some have said that this improves feedback, more personalized feedback, that you would never have the ability to do that, to give that kind of personalized feedback in a face-to-face classroom because of the ability to chat to a student personally and give them that, or in the point of need, feedback in the point of need, which seems to be, again, something which teachers are finding very able to do easily in a remote classroom. But other teachers seem to disagree about that and miss the face-to-face feedback. So I think the jury is out on this one. But I don't think necessarily that. I do think there are obviously some skills that, in terms of teacher training, that can be picked up. The more you work in these environments, the easier it becomes. But I do strongly believe, and a lot of the EdTech people have said this too, that good. It's a truism. Good pedagogy is good pedagogy. Good teaching pedagogy is good. And although I do think that there's a kind of, those is what we should remember, rather than feel that we have to all the time learn, new technical skills. I think that is secondary. Yes, those are going to help and perhaps improve your the efficiency of teaching remotely, being an efficient teacher, but I don't think it necessarily will improve the class per se. You know what I mean?
Super. And I'd just like to end on I think, which is a vital question. I'm sorry if I'm putting you on your spot, Ben. This may not be in your field of expertise.
Yeah,
but I think it's what we need to raise. Nina Ginsberg raises the question, saving on travel to educational institutions. I'd be interested to see or hear conversations about carbon footprint. Saving emission on travel to school for sure, but on the flip side, we're all using more IT equipment, precious metals, resources for product manufacturing, and electricity.
You can't win.
Well, quite. Do we know of any studies that sort of relate to better or worse carbon footprint with all of us teaching from home?
I think, well, I'm not an expert on this, but as you know, my co-author, Kerry Jones, she's one of the people who set up ELT Footprint. So this is something that I would recommend you to go to, the woman who asked the question, to access the ELT Footprint website. There have been a lot of articles about this and blog posts. And actually, it is quite worrying that you would imagine that, you know, saving, you know, not taking the bus or whatever would mean this would obviously help the environment more, but there have been some interesting studies to say that's not true. I think if everyone's cycling around, surely that's the best. my preferred, I mean, this is not answering your question because I wouldn't be able to answer that. I wouldn't know, to be honest, but I would say that probably the best bet is some return to the face-to-face classroom, but people, you know, walking or cycling if possible, and therefore not contaminating.
Excellent. And on that note, just as you were saying that, my son and his friends are gathering outside on their bicycles to go to school.
Okay, well, there you go. In Cambridge, it's almost part of, but it's so much part of daily life, isn't it?
It is. It is. Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today.